The late 19th century was that strange phase in the US's life where it wanted to follow the examples of its larger European cousins. The US had been expanding westward ever since independence, but in the frenzy of new imperialism, the energy to spread American trade networks was aplenty. Then there was Spain, a once large empire which at one time laid claim from the tip of Argentina to the plains of North Dakota, yet now in the 1890s was barely holding on to a few islands in the Caribbean and Pacific. The Spanish quelled any rebellion in an effort to hold on, and we all know nothing brings on American guns for freedom than the tales of people needing to be liberated. After an explosion on the USS Maine, war had begun, and the two countries were at it. The US won splendidly and seized the former Spanish colonies of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, and Cuba. Eventually, the Philippines won their independence after World War II, even after losing a brutal insurrection. Puerto Rico and Guam stayed in the US, and Cuba was allowed to be independent, staying under America's influence until, well, you know. Being 90 miles away from a growing new power, Cuba has always been in the focus of the United States. For 19th century neo-imperialists, the war was a perfect opportunity to incorporate the Cuban island under the Stars and Stripes. Yet in our timeline, it never happened. However, the political energy was so strong for annexation, it brings up an interesting question. What if the United States had annexed Cuba after the Spanish-American War? How would this have changed the relationship between the two? Here is one alternate scenario. In this alternate timeline, the war is over. The Spanish have been defeated, and now the United States is left to wonder how it will control these new territories it has seized from the dead empire. The political energy of the United States at the time was filled with debate over whether imperialism was best for the country, if the US should claim these new lands or simply let them govern themselves. Manifest destiny was still a strong belief at the turn of the century, so there was certainly a faction who wished to profit from Cuban interests. What stopped the US from annexing Cuba in our timeline? One single amendment, called the Teller Amendment. Proposed by Congressman Henry Teller, surprising last name I know, to prevent the option of the US annexing the island, and maybe to protect his own interests in the newly annexed Hawaii. In this alternate timeline, this amendment is simply never proposed. By doing so, this changes the negotiations between the defeated Spanish and the United States. Even though the US destroyed the Spanish Empire, it still wanted to keep relations friendly with their quick foe. In our timeline, even after beating Spain, annexation was not a simple thing to do. It had political consequences. In negotiating the future of the Philippines, Spain wished to hold on to it, and was very resistant to handing it over to the Americans. At first even offering just 2 islands in the archipelago, which the United States immediately shot down, demanding the entire Philippines. To cool down the Spanish, the US offered $20 million to Spain for the Philippines. It was better than nothing, and so Spain agreed. In this alternate timeline, without the Teller Amendment, the United States and Spain negotiate for both the annexation of Cuba and the Philippines. The US has to pay Spain for the annexation of both regions. Yet by annexing every territory won from the Spanish, the Americans harm their own reputation, and the excuse for fighting for Cuban freedom no longer has any basis. The debate is even stronger inside Congress, as many question the US's path down empire, but the treaty still is ratified, and Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba, and the Philippines become a part of the United States' territorial reach. These territories are under the control of the Americans, but that does not mean they automatically become states. Puerto Rico is a commonwealth within the United States, and the debate remains today inside the island whether to join the United States as a state or remain a commonwealth. But enough of that. What would the future hold for Cuba in this alternate timeline? In the years after the war, a Cuban insurgency immediately begins between the natives and the Americans, almost parallel to the situation in the Philippines, in which the natives fought against the Spanish, then turned on the US when America annexed the region. Being so close to the US, Cuban resistance is crushed swiftly, and tension remains between the occupied and the Imperial Americans for a few decades. Yet the war brings up a debate about American intervention across the globe within the public. Each United States territory has gone through its own journey to US statehood that relied on the potential it held and the demographics of the territory. Demographics meaning if they had enough Protestant Anglo citizens. In this alternate timeline, the United States certainly did not want a state filled with Hispanic Catholics, and the Cubans did not want to become a state abiding by the laws of Protestant, English-speaking Americans. The cultural and language difference between the two made eventual statehood an unlikely possibility, so this scenario doesn't involve Cuba becoming a 51st state. Cuba had developed an identity far before annexation, and this still continues under the United States. Americans and Cubans can travel back and forth with ease. Just as many Puerto Ricans migrated to the mainland in our timeline, many Cubans would migrate to the United States, and American citizens could find it easy to set up homes in Cuba. The political issues of the US would strongly affect the Cubans as well. The civil rights movement in this alternate timeline is on two fronts, in the mainland United States and in Cuba. Cuba is a racially diverse nation, and so it faces race problems deeply ingrained in its society as well. In the mid-20th century, civil rights leaders in America inspire Afro-Cubans on the island, who begin to protest against the Spanish-descendant Cubans. Confrontation would occur similar to the Jim Crow South, yet between white Hispanics and black Cubans. Beyond just social, the main relationship between the mainland and island remains economic, as American investors storm the island to capitalize on the potential Cuban market. This isn't much different than in our timeline, as the Platt Amendment put the US in charge of an independent Cuba's affairs. Castro never comes to power, as Batista never gains power in an American-controlled Cuba. While Batista was kept in power by the United States in our timeline, he never would have held power in Commonwealth or Cuban territory, so a communist revolution never happens. Shameless plug, but I explain how this affects other parts of the globe in my other Cuba video. Cuba's destiny in this alternate scenario depends entirely on what status the people would want to be in. Puerto Ricans today have consistently brought their relationship with the US into question, whether to remain a Commonwealth, become independent, or become a state. Cuba in this alternate timeline faces the same questions as well. In the United States mainland, the status of Cuba and the actions which were taken to obtain it are controversial among the American public. The island would remain a constant reminder of America's imperial experiments, being only 90 miles from the shore. In our timeline, imperial remnants still exist, but such reminders are too far away to be brought up into mainstream light. In a realistic scenario, the Cuban quest for independence would always continue in this alternate timeline, not even by violent means, but by peaceful actions. As long as Cuba remained a part of the US, controversy ensues and American imperial intentions are brought into question. By the mid-20th century, with decolonization across the globe, the Cubans are peacefully allowed to leave the United States. Yet Cuba economically is still dominated by US interests, and continues to be well into the present day. If Cuba is annexed by the United States at the end of the Spanish-American War, cultural and linguistic differences never would allow it to become an American state. This is still enough to make the island go down a different path, heavily dictated by American policy, but never seeing the rise of Castro like in our own. In alternate today, Cuba continues to live in the shadow of the United States, but this will always be inevitable as it's so close to the superpower. It continues a close trade relationship with America that has remained unbroken for over a century, as well as remained one of the most popular vacation spots for Americans in the last century. Long story short, lots of Americans on Cuban beaches. This video idea was suggested by Patreon contributor Nicole Kendall. Thanks Nicole for your support.